As we know throughout history, the connection and bond between tribal nations and the U.S. government has never been easy. From treaty making, removals and relocations, and of course, the unforgettable assimilation events that took place within the U.S. and Canadian borders. These constant conflicts, alongside influence from the civil rights movement in the 1960s, the Indian Self-Determination Act of 1975 was created. This act gave back some sovereignty to tribal governments and gave them a little bit of control of their federal funds and operating federal programs. As a whole, these decisions have led to what we now know as the Federal Indian Policy. This policy is supposed to establish a relationship between Indian tribes and the U.S. government, but nationwide issues such as COVID-19, the treaty and trust relationships between governments is still not solidified, especially in regards to public health affairs. But the only way tribal nations are seen involved in intergovernmental agreements was through sharing data, resources, and relief solutions on all cross-jurisdictional issues. Throughout the formation of this issue, various perspectives were called into play. Both Native and non-Native communities faced many disadvantages due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Businesses were drained out of their income due to a lack of customers and the social distancing regulations. And if quarantine was required, citizens faced a shortage of income due to their inability to work. We also saw a lack of proper and engaging education for children in schools. Not only have we seen social and economic effects, but mental health conflicts and suicide rates have rapidly increased for everyone in the various communities. Of course, in both perspectives, there were many doubts, alternating political debates, and non-compliance to the rules and regulations of the implemented policies. This, of course, created a setback in Native and non-Native communities to respond to the COVID issue as a whole and as a nation. But in order to bounce back, both Native and non-Native governments implemented policies and federal changes into the daily lives of their citizens in hopes of finding support and relief due to the COVID-19 issue. As you see within any issue, there's always different societal perspectives that go along with it. But throughout our research of the COVID-19 pandemic and how it impacted the Ho-Chunk Nation, we have seen that systems of privilege and oppression within societal structures is still an important factor in the government's relationship. And in a quote from the United Nations organization, the COVID-19 outbreak affects all segments of the population and is particularly detrimental to members of those social groups in the most vulnerable situations. This can include people living in poverty, older people, people with disability, youth, and indigenous peoples. It goes on to highlight that if not properly addressed through policies, the social crisis created by the COVID-19 pandemic may also increase the inequality, exclusion, discrimination, and the global unemployment of tribal nations in the medium and long term. In another quote from the Brookings Institution, it says, "Further, these losses are set against a backdrop of widening health inequalities for American Indians and Alaska Natives that is rooted in settler colonization, intergenerational trauma, and the continued structural racism. This also includes the federal government's failure to uphold its trust and treaty responsibilities to tribal nations that guarantees them health, education, and public safety services. This COVID-19 pandemic has in new ways illuminated the long legacy of neglect and oppression of Alaskan Natives and American Indians by the U.S. government and by society at large. It has also shown light on cultural and community strengths. This includes the power of tribal self-determination in the fight against the pandemic." In another quote from the Brookings Institution, it highlights the rapid tribally based policy and public health responses to address the COVID-19 issue, infection, and the spread is an illustration of the tribal sovereignty and the tribals' rights to govern themselves and operate as independent nations. Their innovations and the impacts of Indigenous leadership during the pandemic provides striking examples of how the Indigenous people paved the way to protect their communities and promote well-beings.
Administrative orders were placed and the tribe had to shut down their casinos. As a result of this, they filed a lawsuit against their insurer in order to sue them, since there were physical damages to the businesses. This short news segment talks about the Ho-Chunk tribe receiving a relief fund from the U.S. government after being forced to close casinos and losing their jobs. This interactive map shows different characteristics that the Ho-Chunk Nation has received about confirmed positive COVID-19 cases and reported it. Our understanding of COVID-19 has been affected in the regards of how devastating this virus really is. The pandemic has really opened our eyes as it became a bigger threat, not just to our home areas, but learning about the impact on the Ho-Chunk tribe, it was worse than we pictured. As COVID-19 was spread across the United States, our perception was impacted as it became worse everywhere. We realized that we were fortunate that the pandemic did not hit us as personally as hard as it hit the tribe.